In 1025 AD, the Chola Empire launched a naval expedition against the kingdom of Srivijaya, modern-day Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, that crossed over 2,000 kilometers of open ocean, sacked multiple fortified ports, and captured the Srivijayan king. It remains one of the longest-range naval campaigns in the ancient world. The fleet that conducted it carried tens of thousands of soldiers. It returned to India loaded with gold, elephants, and hostages. The campaign is recorded both in Tamil inscriptions on temple walls across South India and in Chinese diplomatic records that noted the sudden disruption to their Srivijayan trading partners. Archaeologists working at Gangaikonda, Cholapuram, the city built by Rajendra Chola I to commemorate this campaign, have found inscriptions listing the names of the conquered kingdoms with a specificity that matches archaeological evidence from those very sites in Southeast Asia. The campaign was real. The victory was real. Then, within 2 centuries, the empire that launched it had been reduced to a minor regional player, squeezed between the Pandya dynasty to its south and the Hoysala kingdom to its north, losing not to a foreign navy, but to succession wars among its own princes that nobody could stop and nobody could win. So here is the question: how does the greatest naval power in the history of the Indian Ocean, an empire that reached across seas nobody else had crossed as a military force, lose everything to a fight inside its own palace? South India in the 9th century was a landscape of perpetual competition among kingdoms whose specific identities, Chola, Pandya, Pallava, Rashtrakuta, Gangas, were ancient but whose political boundaries were not. The Tamil-speaking south had been governed by these competing royal families for centuries, each controlling specific river valleys, coastal territories, and trade routes, each maintaining a court culture of considerable sophistication whose literary output, the Sangam literature, of the earlier period, is among the most remarkable in the ancient world. The competition was not simply territorial, it was cultural and religious. The patronage of temples, the sponsorship of Brahmin scholars, the cultivation of the Tamil literary tradition were as much markers of royal legitimacy as military conquest. A king who built a great temple, funded a distinguished Brahmin establishment, and earned the praise of respected poets was making a claim to authority that complemented, and in some respects exceeded the claim made by battlefield victory. The specific combination of military and cultural competition that defined South Indian royal politics made the region's courts among the most intellectually productive in the medieval world, and also made its political conflicts nearly impossible to resolve definitively. You could defeat an enemy's army without destroying his cultural claims to legitimacy, and the temple he had built would outlast both your victory and his defeat. The Pallava dynasty, which had dominated the Tamil country in the 7th and 8th centuries, had been weakened by sustained military pressure from the Rashtrakuta kingdom to the north, and by the internal dynamics of a court culture that tended to produce succession disputes whenever a strong ruler was followed by a less capable heir. By the mid-9th century, Pallava power was contracting, and the specific territories they had controlled in the Kaveri River Delta, among the most agriculturally productive in South India, were becoming available for a new regional power to claim. The Chola dynasty that Vijayalaya established in 848 CE was not, at its inception, an empire or even a major kingdom. It was a regional power in the Kaveri Delta that Vijayalaya, a minor chieftain who had been subordinate of the Pallavas, carved out of the political vacuum created by the Pallava decline and the distraction of the Rashtrakutas in the north. His capture of Thanjavur, the city that would become the Chola capital and remain the centre of Tamil cultural identity, was a military action of modest regional significance. Its long-term consequences were enormous. What Vijayalaya and his successors understood, which the Pallavas had understood only partially, was the specific strategic value of the Kaveri Delta's geography. The delta's agricultural productivity, sustained by the extensive irrigation infrastructure that Tamil farmers had maintained for centuries, generated the surplus that funded military expansion. The coastline that the delta opened onto provided access to maritime trade routes that, if controlled, could generate revenue that agricultural taxation alone could never match. And the specific geographic position of the Chola heartland, between the Bay of Bengal and the Western Ghats, with the Kaveri connecting the interior to the sea, made naval power not just an option but a natural expression of the region's geographic logic. The Chola dynasty's origin is one of the more genealogically contested questions in Indian historical scholarship, partly because the dynasty itself cultivated an elaborate mythological ancestry that subsequent historians have to work carefully around to reach the historical substrate, and partly because the specific mechanisms of the dynasty's rise in the mid-9th century are documented more richly in the stone inscriptions they carved on temples than in any continuous narrative historical source. The Sangam-era literary tradition, the body of classical Tamil poetry composed in roughly the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, mentions Chola kings as patrons and military figures in ways that establish the dynasty's ancient pedigree without providing clear genealogical connections to the medieval dynasty that Vijayalaya founded. The medieval Chola kings were certainly aware of this ancient literary tradition, and they cultivated the connection actively, claiming descent from the Sangam-era Chola kings, incorporating references to the ancient poetry in their own inscriptions, and positioning themselves as the revival of a glorious tradition rather than as new arrivals in the political landscape. The specific genealogical claims in the Chola copperplate grants, the formal legal documents issued to record land grants, immunities, and royal appointments, are the primary documentary source for the dynasty's self-understanding of its origin. These documents, composed in Sanskrit, Tamil, and occasionally both, typically begin with a genealogical section tracing the current king's ancestry back to mythological solar origins and forward through a series of ancestral kings whose names and claimed achievements provide a dynastic narrative. The historical analysis of these genealogical sections, comparing them against external sources, looking for internal inconsistencies, and assessing the plausibility of the claims, has occupied scholars of South Indian history for more than a century. What modern population genetics adds to this picture is interesting but limited. Studies of Tamil populations, including work published by the Centre for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad, in collaboration with international researchers, have confirmed that South Indian populations, including Tamil-speaking communities, show genetic patterns consistent with the long-term settlement and relative isolation of the subcontinent's southern regions. The specific genetic signature of any royal family, however, is too small a contribution to any modern population's genome to be identifiable through the population-level studies that have been conducted. The temple inscriptions, which the Chola kings produced in extraordinary quantity, and which the Archaeological Survey of India has been systematically documenting and translating since the colonial period, are the richest source of information about the dynasty's history. The larger Leiden grant, discovered in the Netherlands in the 19th century and dating to approximately 15 CE, is one of the most significant single documents. A 40-verse Sanskrit and Tamil copperplate recording a gift to a Buddhist monastery in Nagapattinam that also contains valuable information about Chola geography, administration, and diplomatic relations at the dynasty's peak. The Indian Ocean is not a uniform body of water. It is a seasonal system, organized around the monsoon winds that reverse direction twice a year and that, for the maritime civilizations that understood how to use them, provided a reliable mechanism for sailing both eastward and westward in different seasons. A sailor who understood the monsoon calendar could leave South India in the summer, ride the southwest monsoon to Southeast Asia, wait for the northeast monsoon, and return, making the entire round trip in approximately 1 year without sailing against the prevailing winds at any point. The Chola Empire occupied precisely the geographic position that best placed a maritime power to exploit this seasonal system. The Coromandel coast, the southeastern coast of India, from what is now Andhra Pradesh southward through Tamil Nadu, faces the Bay of Bengal with a series of natural harbours and river mouths that provided both shelter for fleets and access to the agricultural interior. The Kaveri River Delta, in particular, created a maritime interface between the grain-producing interior and the trade routes that crossed the Bay of Bengal to southeast Asia and the wider Indian Ocean. The Kaveri itself, the river that the Chola court called their sacred river, that the Tamil literary tradition treated as a goddess, and that the dynasty's agricultural base depended on, flows from the Western Ghats across the Deccan Plateau and into the Bay of Bengal through one of the most extensively irrigated agricultural landscapes in South India. The specific irrigation infrastructure that Tamil farmers had maintained for centuries, the Anicut wares that diverted the Kaveri's flow into, networks of channels serving hundreds of thousands of acres of paddy land, was the foundation of the agricultural surplus that funded everything else. The specific trade commodities that moved through Chola-controlled ports in the period of the dynasty's peak include cotton textiles. South Indian cotton cloth was among the most valued in the medieval Indian Ocean trade. Pepper and other spices from the Malabar coast to the west, which transited South India on their way to the eastern trade routes, and the luxury goods of the Southeast Asian trade. Camphor, cloves, nutmeg, and the resins and aromatics whose market in India, Persia, and China was insatiable. The revenues from taxing this trade, both the goods moving through Chola ports and the protection services that Chola naval power offered to merchants navigating the Bay of Bengal, provided a fiscal resource complementary to the agricultural base and potentially much more elastic in its growth potential. The maritime geography of the Bay of Bengal also defined the Chola Empire's strategic priorities in ways that distinguished them sharply from the other medieval Indian kingdoms they coexisted with. The Rashtrakutas to the north, the Pandyas to the south, and the Hoysalas to the northwest were fundamentally land powers, whose military capabilities and economic foundations were built around the control of river valleys and agricultural territories. The Cholas, uniquely among South Indian powers, invested systematically in naval capability, building and maintaining the fleet infrastructure that made possible the campaigns in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and eventually Southeast Asia that define the dynasty's historical identity. The transformation of the Chola kingdom from a regional power in the Kaveri Delta into a maritime empire controlling trade routes across the Bay of Bengal was accomplished across approximately a century and a half, from Vijayalaya's founding in 848 CE through the reign of Rajaraja Chola I, who died in 1014 CE, by a combination of military expansion, administrative innovation, and the specific institutional development of naval capability. The administrative system that the Chola Empire developed was organized around a hierarchy of territorial units whose specific names and boundaries varied across the dynasty's history, but whose general structure, village, assemblies, sub-district councils, district administrations, and regional governorships, provided a layered governance framework that distributed administrative responsibility while maintaining central political control. The Tamil inscriptions from this period, which document land grants, temple endowments, and administrative regulations in extraordinary detail, give historians a picture of Chola provincial governance that is richer than what is available for most medieval Asian states. The village assembly, the Natu, and Sabha institutions that govern different categories of Tamil village, is the most celebrated feature of Chola administrative history. The Uttaramarur inscriptions from a village near Kanchipuram, dating to approximately 920 CE, record in detail the qualifications, selection procedures, and term limits for members of the village council. These inscriptions have been cited by subsequent scholars as evidence of a form of representative local governance in medieval India, though the institutions they describe served propertied Brahmin landholders rather than the village population as a whole. and their relationship to modern democratic theory requires careful qualification. The naval capability that Rajaraja Chola built was institutional as well as material. The construction and maintenance of large ocean-going vessels required specialist skills. The Tamil guilds of shipbuilders, sailmakers, and navigators whose specific expertise was hereditary and regionally concentrated, and institutional support in the form of harbour infrastructure, stores of naval supplies, and the administrative organisation required to provision and coordinate large fleets on extended operations. The Chola court's investment in this infrastructure, documented in the temple inscriptions and copper plates that record royal gifts and administrative appointments, represents a deliberate policy choice to develop naval capability as a strategic priority. The conquest of northern Sri Lanka, Elam in the Tamil sources, was the first major military projection beyond the Indian mainland, accomplished by Rajaraja Chola in approximately 993 CE. Sri Lanka's strategic significance was multiple. It controlled the sea lanes through the Pork Strait between South India and the island. It was a source of gems and pearls that were among the most valuable commodities in the Indian Ocean trade, and its northern Tamil-speaking population provided a natural cultural connection to the Chola Empire's own Tamil-speaking core. The conquest also demonstrated that the Chola fleet was capable of the amphibious operations, landing large forces on hostile shores that more ambitious projections of power would require. The Chola military's combination of conventional land forces and specialized naval capability made it unique among medieval Indian military systems, and understanding the specific technical and organizational features of each component helps explain both the dynasty's peak achievements and the specific vulnerabilities that eventually became fatal. The core of the Chola land army was its elephant corps, infantry, and cavalry, the three conventional components of the medieval Indian military tradition. War elephants provided the shock action that could break enemy formations. Infantry with spears, swords, and bows provided the mass and sustained pressure that elephants alone could not maintain. Cavalry provided mobility, reconnaissance, and the pursuit that completed a victory. The Chola army at its peak was large enough. Contemporary inscriptions speak of forces of tens of thousands for major campaigns to conduct operations on multiple fronts simultaneously, though the logistical demands of feeding and supplying such forces meant that campaigns were typically seasonal, pausing during the monsoon when road conditions deteriorated. The naval component was the truly distinctive element. The Chola navy operated vessels that the Tamil sources call maramaram, ocean-going ships whose specific construction, by the available evidence, combined features of the South Indian maritime tradition with influences from the Southeast Asian shipbuilding practices that Chola maritime contacts had exposed. The sewn plank construction technique, in which hull planks were fastened with cords rather than iron nails, a technique common in the Indian Ocean maritime tradition, produced vessels that were flexible enough to withstand the stresses of ocean swells that would crack rigidly fastened hulls. The specific vessels used for the Srivijaya expedition were large enough to carry substantial numbers of soldiers and enough supplies for a weeks-long ocean crossing. The 1025 CE expedition against Srivijaya, launched by Rajendra Chola I in retaliation for Srivijayan interference with Indian Ocean trade, represents the Chola military's peak achievement and one of the most remarkable military operations of the medieval world. The fleet crossed from the Coromandel coast to Sumatra, a distance of approximately 2,000 kilometers of open ocean, attacked and tank-captured multiple Srivijayan ports including Kadaram, the site of modern-day Kedah in Malaysia, and returned to India with the captured king, hostages, and substantial loot. The entire operation required months of planning, the construction or assembly of a fleet sufficient for the crossing, and the logistical provision of food, water, and weapons for a force of this size over an extended operation. The inscription recording this campaign, carved on the walls of the Brihadisvara temple at Gangaikonda, Cholapuram, lists 14 conquered territories with a specificity that archaeologists have been matching against the physical evidence from Southeast Asian sites for decades. The names match known sites in what are now Malaysia, Sumatra, and the Thai Malay Peninsula. The campaign's impact on Srivijayan commercial activity is visible in Chinese trade records of the period, which document a disruption to the tribute missions from Srivijaya that coincides with the Chola campaign. Rajaraja Chola I, whose name translates as King of Kings, is the most celebrated ruler in the dynasty's history, and his reign from approximately 985 to 1014 CE represents the Chola Empire's first peak of territorial expansion and institutional development. Understanding him clearly requires separating the mythological overlay that subsequent Chola inscriptions placed over his memory from the historical record of what his reign actually achieved and at what cost. His military campaigns were systematic rather than opportunistic, a series of operations conducted over nearly 3 years that progressively expanded Chola control over the territories required for the maritime empire he was constructing. The conquest of the Pihandya territories in the extreme south of India, the subjugation of Kerala on the western coast, the campaign in Sri Lanka, and the naval operations in the Maldive Islands were not random wars of aggression, but a coherent strategic program aimed at controlling the coastal territories and island stepping stones that maritime dominance required. The Brihadisvara temple at Thanjavur, begun by Rajaraja in 1003 CE and completed before his death in 1014 CE, is the most direct physical expression of his reign's achievement and ambition. The temple's Vimana, the tower over the main sanctuary, rises approximately 66 meters, making it the tallest structure in India at the time of its construction. The specific engineering challenge of constructing a masonry tower of this height, the calculations required to manage the compressive forces in the stone, the organization of the labor force required to quarry, transport, and place the stones, and the design of the internal structure, has been studied by modern structural engineers who find the solution genuinely sophisticated. Archaeologists from the Archaeological Survey of India have been systematically documenting the Brihadisvara temple complex since the 19th century, and the findings from this work, combined with the epigraphic analysis of the hundreds of inscriptions carved on the temple walls, have produced an exceptionally detailed picture of the building's construction, subsequent modifications, and the administrative organization of the temple establishment that maintained it. The inscriptions record not just the temple's construction history, but the names and duties of hundreds of temple servants, the endowments of land and gold that funded the temple's ritual life, and the specific ceremonies performed in the complex. A documentary record that allows historians to reconstruct the lived religious culture of Rajaraja's Thanjavur in considerable detail. His son Rajendra Chola I, whose Srivijaya campaign is the dynasty's most spectacular military achievement, inherited a consolidated empire and expanded it further, adding territories in the Ganges plain and in the Malay archipelago to the already extensive domain. His construction of a new capital city, Gangaikonda Cholapuram, the city of the king who conquered the Ganges, announced his claim to have exceeded even his father's achievements. For the agricultural population of the Tamil country, the farmers who cultivated the paddy fields of the Kaveri Delta, the craftsmen who produced the textiles and metalwork for which South India was famous, and the fishermen and sailors whose work sustained the maritime economy, daily life during the Chola period was shaped by the specific rhythms of an agricultural and maritime economy operating within the institutional framework of one of the most administratively sophisticated states in medieval Asia. The Kaveri Delta's paddy agriculture was organized around a specific seasonal calendar determined by the river's flood cycle and the monsoon rains. Planting in the early monsoon, cultivation through the growing season, harvest in the dry months. The agricultural year was as fixed in its rhythms as the maritime calendar that determined the trade fleet's movements. The irrigation infrastructure that distributed the Kaveri's water across the delta, the Grand Anicut Dam across the river's main channel, attributed in Tamil tradition to the early Chola kings, but improved and maintained across the dynasty's history, was one of the engineering achievements that made the delta's extraordinary agricultural productivity possible. The Grand Anicut is particularly interesting from an engineering perspective. A weir across a major river that distributes its flow through a network of channels requires careful design to manage the flood pressures of the monsoon season without failing. The specific construction of the original Chola period Anicut, likely a rubble and masonry structure, whose design principles have been studied by engineers of the modern Tamil Nadu Water Management Authority, maintained the delta's irrigation for centuries before the British colonial era engineer Arthur Cotton rebuilt and improved it in the 1830s. The structure Cotton found when he arrived was ancient and functional, evidence of a civil engineering tradition that had maintained major hydraulic infrastructure across a millennium. The urban population of Chola cities, Thanjavur, Gangaikonda, Cholapuram, Nagapattinam, the major port, was significantly smaller than the contemporary cities of Tang China or Abbasid Baghdad, but the density of commercial and cultural activity in these centres was considerable. The port of Nagapattinam on the Coromandel coast was one of the most active in South Asia, serving as the primary point of contact between the Chola Empire and the maritime trade networks of the Bay of Bengal. Chinese, Arab, and Southeast Asian merchants maintained permanent communities there, and the port's institutions, harbour facilities, warehouse districts, temples serving multiple religious communities, reflected this commercial diversity. The Tamil merchant guilds that organised long-distance trade during the Chola period were among the most sophisticated commercial institutions of the medieval world. The Ayavol 500, the trading confederation documented in inscriptions from multiple sites across South India and even from Southeast Asia, operate across an enormous geographic range, maintaining their own security forces for trade route protection, their own dispute resolution mechanisms, and their own system of commercial reputation that allowed members to transact business at distant sites with strangers who had no personal knowledge of them. The inscriptions documenting these guilds' activities, found at sites from Karnataka in the north to Sri Lanka in the south and at Southeast Asian sites, including Sumatra and Malaysia, are one of the most remarkable bodies of commercial documentation from medieval Asia. The Chola Empire's urban centres were defined less by their population scale. South Indian cities of the medieval period were smaller than the great cities of China or the Islamic world, than by the specific combination of religious monumentality, commercial vitality, and administrative sophistication that made them the centres of one of the most complex civilizations in the medieval world. Thanjavur, the dynasty's first great capital, is dominated to this day by the Brihadisvara temple's tower, which remains the most visible structure on the Tamil Nadu skyline for kilometres in every direction. The temple complex that Rajaraja built around the central sanctuary covered several hectares, encompassing multiple subsidiary shrines, a large rectangular tank for ritual bathing, and the residential and administrative buildings that housed the several hundred priests, attendants, dancers, musicians, and administrative staff who maintained the temple's continuous ritual life. The specific organization of the Brihadisvara temple's personnel and endowments is known in unusual detail because Rajaraja commissioned a comprehensive set of inscriptions recording the temple's establishment, the lands donated for its maintenance, the gold and jewels dedicated to its treasury, the number and duties of every category of person employed in its service. These inscriptions, carved on the walls of the temple's inner circuit, have been studied by epigraphers and historians since the late 19th century and constitute one of the most detailed records of a medieval Indian religious institutions organization available from any period. The inscriptions record, among many other things, the establishment of a dance troupe of 400 women, Devadasis, literally servants of the god, whose performance of specific dances at specific times of day and on specific festival occasions was part of the temple's ritual program. The specific dances they performed, documented in the inscriptions by name and occasion, are connected by historians of South Indian dance to the classical Bharatanatyam tradition, establishing the Chola period as one of the key formative periods in the development of this dance form, which UNESCO recognized in 2016 as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Gangaikonda Cholapuram, the new capital built by Rajendra Chola I in approximately 1025 CE to celebrate his Ganges campaign, is today largely a ruin, its original city reduced to the temple complex at its center, whose survival is owed to the durability of its stone construction. The city that surrounded the temple, the palaces, markets, residential quarters, and administrative buildings that made a working capital, is gone, its materials long since reused by subsequent builders or returned to the soil. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India across multiple seasons since the 1970s, have identified the city's extent and some features of its layout. But the contrast between the surviving temple and the vanished city is a lesson in the differential durability of religious and secular architecture. The Nagapattinam port was the Chola Empire's primary commercial interface with the wider world, and its specific archaeological record, partially investigated in excavations conducted by Indian archaeologists in the 20th century and potentially more extensively documented in Chinese and Arab sources that describe the port's facilities, reflects the commercial diversity of the Indian Ocean trade world at its medieval peak. The Chola Empire was, in its official religious identity, a Shaivite Hindu kingdom, a state whose kings presented themselves as devotees and servants of the god Shiva, whose temple-building programs expressed this devotion in some of the most magnificent religious architecture ever constructed, and whose court culture was shaped by the specifically South Indian Bhakti devotional tradition that had given the Tamil country a rich literature of personal religious poetry. The Shaivite identity of the Chola kings was not simply a matter of personal faith. It was a political instrument of considerable subtlety. The king who built a great Shiva temple was not just performing religious devotion, he was demonstrating royal munificence, providing employment and resources for the Brahmin communities whose ritual services the temple required, creating a focal point for the local communities whose identity was shaped by the temple's festivals and rituals, and making a claim to divine favor that legitimized his political authority. The temple was simultaneously a religious institution, an economic institution, a political institution, and a cultural institution, and its construction and maintenance were understood as royal obligations as much as personal acts of piety. The Brihadisvara temple's presiding deity, the Shivalinga at the center of the main sanctuary, approximately 4 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter, was Rajaraja's chosen form of the god, consecrated with the name Rajarajesvara, the Lord of Rajaraja, in a deliberate fusion of divine and royal identities. The temple's name as an institution, also Rajarajesvara, further collapsed the distinction between the king's identity and the god's, a theological move consistent with the Devaraja, god-king, tradition of royal legitimation that had spread across South and Southeast Asia from its Indian origins. The specific theological tradition that the Chola kings patronized was the Shaiva Siddhanta, a philosophical system developed by Tamil Brahmin scholars that synthesized Sanskrit Shaiva metaphysics with the devotional Tamil Bhakti tradition. The combination of sophisticated philosophical theology and accessible devotional practice that Shaiva Siddhanta provided was well suited to the political needs of a dynasty that needed to legitimize its authority to both the Sanskrit-educated Brahmin elite and the Tamil-speaking common people. The Tevaram, the collection of hymns composed by the 3 great Shaiva saint poets of the early medieval Tamil period, was compiled and given canonical status during the Chola period. And its irregular recitation in Chola temples institutionalized the emotional devotionalism of the Bhakti movement within the formal ritual structure of the Brahmin-managed temple establishment. The Buddhist monastery at Nagapattinam, the Chudamani Vihara built by a Srivijayan ruler with Chola permission and documented in both the larger Leiden Grant and in Chinese sources, is evidence that the Chola Empire's religious tolerance extended, at least in commercially significant cases, to maintaining Buddhist institutional presence in its ports. This was commercial pragmatism as much as religious generosity. The Srivijayan and Chinese Buddhist merchants whose trade the Nagapattinam port depended on would have found a familiar religious environment reassuring, and the monastery served as an institutional symbol of the commercial relationships whose maintenance was economically essential. The Chola Empire's technological achievements were concentrated in three areas whose specific developments shaped the material culture of South Indian civilization for centuries: naval architecture and maritime navigation, monumental stone construction, and the bronze casting tradition, whose masterworks are among the most celebrated sculptures in the history of world art. The Chola bronze casting tradition, producing images of Hindu deities using the lost wax casting process, whose technical demands are considerable, reached its peak during the Rajaraja and Rajendra period of the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The specific bronze images produced in this period, the dancing Shiva, the Nataraja, is the most internationally recognized, are, by the assessment of art historians who study them in terms of both technical execution and aesthetic achievement, among the finest bronze sculptures ever made. The Nataraja image, Shiva as the Lord of Dance, depicted in a circular frame of flames, one leg raised in the dance pose, one arm holding the drum of creation, another bearing the fire of destruction, encodes in visual form a complete cosmological theology. The specific iconographic program is described in detail in the agamic texts that governed Shiva temple ritual, and the Chola sculptors who produced the canonical images translated those textual specifications into three-dimensional form with a mastery of human anatomy and dramatic pose that modern art historians consistently find remarkable. The technical analysis of Chola bronzes, conducted by researchers using X-ray fluorescence, lead isotope analysis, and detailed visual examination, has revealed information about the specific alloy compositions, casting techniques, and workshop practices of the Chola period bronze casting tradition. The alloy used, approximately 90% copper, with controlled additions of tin and small amounts of lead and zinc, was specifically chosen for its casting properties and its surface color after finishing, and the consistency of the alloy composition across bronzes from different sites and different periods suggests either standardized workshop practice or controlled distribution of alloy components. The maritime navigation technology that made the Srivijaya expedition possible is less well documented but clearly real. Crossing 2,000 kilometers of open ocean without the ability to navigate at night and in cloudy weather is simply impossible, and the Tamil maritime tradition clearly possessed astronomical navigation techniques, using the position of stars and the sun for directional reference that were adequate for the voyages the Chola fleet undertook. The specific navigational knowledge, which stars to use, how to maintain course in changing winds, how to identify approaching land from the behavior of currents and birds, was embedded in the oral tradition of the Tamil fishing and trading communities whose expertise the Chola Navy drew on, and its reconstruction is one of the ongoing projects of historical maritime studies. The stone construction techniques used in Chola temple building, particularly the specific methods for quarrying, transporting, and placing the massive stone blocks that compose the Brihadisvara Vimana, have been studied by engineers who find the solutions genuinely sophisticated. The capstone of the Brihadisvara Vimana weighs approximately 80 tons. Placing it at a height of 60 meters required either a ramp of extraordinary size or a mechanical lifting system of considerable capability. The physical evidence of the ramp, A gradual earthen approach path several kilometers long has been identified in the landscape around Thanjavur by archaeologists who found traces of the ramp's construction material, confirming that the medieval engineers used the simplest possible solution rather than elaborate machinery. The Chola Empire's decline was not the result of a single decisive military defeat or the emergence of an overwhelmingly powerful external enemy. It was the outcome of a prolonged process in which the dynasty's external enemies, the Pandya dynasty to the south, the Hoysala kingdom to the northwest, exploited the specific vulnerabilities created by the Chola Empire's succession politics and administrative geography. The Pandya dynasty was the Cholas' oldest and most persistent rival in South India. The two dynasties had been competing for control of the Tamil country for centuries before the Chola imperial period, and the Pandya court maintained a tradition of cultural and political legitimacy rooted in the same Tamil literary heritage that the Cholas claimed. The Pandya king's court at Madurai, the city associated in Tamil tradition with the Sangamera Literary Academy, the Kankam, was a cultural as well as political centre whose prestige was not simply a function of military power. The specific vulnerability that Pandya pressure exploited was the progressive weakening of the Chola succession. The pattern of contested successions, regent regimes, and competing claimants that characterized the dynasty's later period and that diverted military and administrative resources from external defense to internal competition. A dynasty in the middle of a succession war is a dynasty that cannot consistently project military force against external enemies, and the Pandyas were sufficiently patient and sufficiently capable to take advantage of each period of Chola internal distraction to recover territories and build military capacity. The Hoysala kingdom to the northwest, whose territory in the Karnataka plateau abutted the Chola Empire's northern frontier, represented a different kind of threat. The Hoysalas were not an ancient enemy with cultural claims competing against Chola legitimacy. They were a rising power whose expansion southward brought them into conflict with Chola territories in the 12th century. Their specific military capability, a well-organized infantry force supplemented by elephant corps that was effective in the forested terrain of the Karnataka plateau, made them difficult opponents for the Chola cavalry and elephant military system in the specific geographic conditions of the borderlands between the two kingdoms. The inscriptions from the late Chola period, dated to the 12th and early 13th centuries, show a pattern of increasingly localized authority, with regional chieftains asserting privileges and immunities that the strong Chola kings of the dynasty's peak would never have tolerated. The administrative system that Rajaraja had built, with its precise hierarchy of territorial units all ultimately accountable to the central court, was eroding as the dynasty's ability to enforce its terms deteriorated. The local strongmen who took advantage of this erosion were not rebels or separatists. They were rational actors responding to the changing power balance by claiming what they could get. The Chola Empire at its territorial maximum, the combined reign of Rajaraja Chola I and Rajendra Chola I, approximately 985 to 1044 CE, controlled a territory that extended from the Kaveri Delta heartland northward to the Tungabhadra River, southward through the Pandya territories to the tip of the subcontinent, across the Palk Strait to northern Sri Lanka, through the Maldive Islands, and, in the context of the Srivijaya campaign, to the Malay Peninsula and coastal Sumatra. This was not the largest empire of its era. The Fatimid Caliphate in the Middle East and North Africa, the Song dynasty in China, and the Byzantine Empire in the eastern Mediterranean each controlled large arid territories with larger populations. But in the specific domain of Indian Ocean maritime power, the Chola Empire was unequalled. No other state in the Indian Ocean world had the naval capability to project military force across the distances the Chola fleet demonstrated, and no other state maintained the combination of naval power and commercial infrastructure that gave the Chola courts their extraordinary wealth. The specific wealth of the Chola Empire at its peak is documented both in the inscriptions which record the gold, gems, and elephants captured in military campaigns, and the enormous endowments made to temples from royal treasury resources, and in the material evidence of the bronzes, the temple construction, and the court culture whose products have survived. The Brihadisvara temple's treasury, documented in the dedicatory inscriptions, contained gold objects weighing in the thousands of tolams, an ancient Indian weight unit, plus hundreds of silver objects, thousands of copper vessels, and an extraordinary collection of jeweled ornaments. This was the wealth of a dynasty that had been extracting revenue from one of the most productive agricultural regions in South Asia and taxing one of the busiest maritime trade routes in the world for more than a century. The diplomatic contacts maintained by the Chola court at its peak reflect the dynasty's position in the wider world. Chinese Song Dynasty records document Chola tribute missions arriving in China in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, missions that were simultaneously commercial ventures and diplomatic initiatives carrying goods for the Chinese market while maintaining the formal recognition that tributary status in the Chinese order provided. The Arab geographer al-Biruni, writing in approximately 1030 CE, provides a description of South India that includes information consistent with Chola power at its height. The Southeast Asian kingdoms, whose rulers the Srivijaya campaign displaced, maintained correspondence with the Chola court that is visible in both Tamil and Southeast Asian sources. The beginning of the Chola Empire's decline is conventionally dated to the second half of the 12th century, when the dynasty's succession pattern, which had produced a series of competent and militarily active kings through the 11th century, began generating the contested successions and regent regimes whose political costs would prove impossible to sustain. The specific mechanism was familiar from the dynasties discussed earlier in this series, and it is worth stating plainly. The Chola Empire had no reliable succession procedure beyond the principle that the eldest son of the reigning king should succeed him. When the reigning king had multiple sons by multiple queens, when the eldest son died before his father, or when powerful court factions had interests in preferring one claimant over another, this principle provided insufficient guidance to prevent competition among potential successors from becoming violent. The 12th century Chola kings, Vikrama Chola, Kulatunga II, Rajaraja II, Rajaraja III, were each capable of maintaining the empire's basic structure during their individual reigns, but none produced the decisive campaign victories or administrative consolidations that might have reversed the gradual territorial shrinkage. The Pandya territories in the extreme south, which had been under Chola suzerainty since Rajaraja I's conquests, were progressively reasserting independence. The Sri Lanka territories, whose control had depended on sustained naval commitment, were becoming difficult to maintain as the Navy's operational priority shifted to managing threats closer to the Tamil heartland. The revenue consequences of territorial shrinkage compounded the political consequences. An empire whose territorial base is contracting generates less revenue from the territories it loses, which reduces the resources available for the military operations that might recover those territories, which accelerates further contraction. This specific feedback loop, fiscal deterioration driving military weakness, driving further fiscal deterioration, is visible in the Chola inscriptional record of the 12th century, where the temple endowments and royal gifts that document the court's wealth become progressively smaller and more local in their geographic scope. The agricultural disruption that accompanied the political instability of the late Chola period is difficult to document directly, but can be inferred from the evidence of peasant unrest. The decline in irrigation maintenance that would have been visible in the reduced agricultural output documented in tax records, and the demographic disruption of populations in territories that changed hands between competing Chola, Pandya, and Hoysala forces. The Kaveri Delta's irrigation infrastructure, the Grand Anicut, and the network of channels it fed, required continuous maintenance to function, and the diversion of labour and administrative capacity to military purposes during periods of instability inevitably meant that maintenance was deferred and agricultural productivity declined. The Chola Empire's formal end conventionally dated to 1279 CE, when the last Chola king Rajendra, Chola III, was defeated by the Pandya king Maravaman Kulasekara, and the dynasty ceased to function as a political entity. Was the conclusion of a century-long process of territorial contraction and political fragmentation rather than a sudden military catastrophe. By the mid-13th century, the Chola heartland in the Kaveri Delta was all that remained of the dynasty's earlier territorial extent. The Pandya dynasty had recovered its southern territories and was pressing northward with an increasingly confident military capability. The Hoysala kingdom to the northwest had established a permanent presence in territories that had been Chola 2 generations earlier, and the successors of the Srivijayan maritime network, whose disruption by the Chola campaigns of the 11th century had created temporary Chola dominance in the Bay of Bengal, had reorganized under new political arrangements that no longer acknowledged any special Chola commercial or political privilege. The last century of Chola rule in the Thanjavur region is visible primarily through the inscriptional record. The temple, dedications, land grants, and administrative documents that continued to be produced even as the dynasty's effective territorial authority contracted. The inscriptions from this period show a dynasty maintaining the forms of imperial culture, the titles, the ceremonial language, the temple patronage, while the substance of empire had largely disappeared. Rajendra Chola III was making temple grants in the 1270s with the same elaborate Sanskrit and Tamil honorifics that Rajaraja Aphice had used 2.5 centuries earlier, even as his actual authority over the territory around the temples he was endowing was contested or absent. The Pandya conquest that ended the dynasty was not a single dramatic victory. It was a progressive military pressure that the Chola court's depleted resources could not resist. The Brihadisvara temple, Rajaraja's greatest monument, was not destroyed. The physical remains of the Chola capital were not razed. What ended was the political institution. The Chola royal family lost the capacity to maintain an army, collect taxes, appoint officials, and exercise the other functions of sovereign authority. The dynasty faded out rather than burned out. The Tamil cultural identity that the Chola Empire had expressed in its temples, its literature, its music, and its bronze sculptures did not fade with the dynasty. The Brihadisvara temple continued to function as a religious institution under Pandya, Vijayanagara, Nayaka, and eventually Maratha patronage. Its ritual life maintained continuously from Rajaraja's consecration in 1010 CE to the present day. The bronze images produced during the Chola period were preserved, venerated, and eventually recognized as treasures of world cultural heritage. The Bharatanatyam dance tradition that developed in the Chola temple context was maintained through the Devadasi tradition, controversial in the colonial period, suppressed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and subsequently revived as a concert dance form into the contemporary world. The Chola Empire's legacy is distributed across 3 major domains: the physical remains of its architecture and art, the documentary record of its inscriptions, and the living traditions of Tamil culture that trace their ancestry to the Chola period, each of which is the subject of ongoing scholarly investigation, whose findings continuously expand the understanding of what the dynasty actually achieved and how it actually functioned. The epigraphic record of the Chola Empire is the richest in the history of South India and one of the richest in the world. The Archaeological Survey of India's Epigraphia Indica and South Indian Inscriptions series, ongoing documentary projects that began in the colonial period and continue to the present, have published thousands of Chola period inscriptions in transcription and translation, with many more remaining unpublished. The inscriptions carved on temple walls, on copper plates, on stone stelae, and on rock faces across Tamil Nadu, Sri Lanka, and Kerala document the dynasty's administrative, religious, and commercial activities at a level of detail that is genuinely extraordinary. The Tanjore Brihadisvara temple inscriptions, the comprehensive series of records from the founding period that document the temple's personnel, endowments, and rituals, have been the subject of sustained scholarly attention since the 19th century, but digital humanities methods are now enabling new approaches to the analysis of this material. Projects at institutions including the French Institute of Pondicherry and the University of Hamburg are applying text mining, network analysis, and geographic information systems to the inscriptional corpus in ways that reveal patterns in the administrative geography, the social relationships, and the economic transactions documented in the inscriptions that traditional reading methods could not identify. The bronze images of the Chola period present an ongoing challenge for art historians, museum curators, and the Indian government because the international art market's demand for South Indian bronzes has fueled a sustained traffic in looted temple images whose scale has only recently become fully visible. The Idol Wing of the Tamil Nadu Police, a specialist unit established in 2013 and expanded in subsequent years, has been investigating the networks through which Chola period bronzes and other South Indian religious art entered the international art market, and the investigations have revealed connections to major international auction houses, museums, and private collections whose acquisition practices were inadequate to detect or prevent the receipt of stolen material. The 2014 repatriation of a bronze Nataraja from a Christie's auction in New York, where the auction house withdrew the item after the idol wing identified it as a piece stolen from the Sri Paranthan temple in Tamil Nadu, was the first of a series of high-profile returns that has brought the issue of looted Chola bronzes to international attention. Subsequent repatriations have come from the National Gallery of Australia, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, each case representing a combination of investigative work by the Tamil Nadu authorities, international diplomatic pressure, and in some cases the voluntary cooperation of the holding institution. The genetic evidence for the continuity of Tamil populations from the Chola period to the present is consistent with the historical record's account of a relatively stable cultural and demographic landscape in South India. Studies of Tamil populations from both India and Sri Lanka, including work that has used ancient DNA from skeletal remains at archaeological sites in Tamil Nadu, confirm a population structure that has been relatively isolated from the large-scale population movements that characterize the northern Indian subcontinent, and that shows genetic continuity across a long time period, consistent with the cultural and linguistic stability that the historical sources document. The living cultural legacy of the Chola Empire is perhaps more robustly present in contemporary South Indian culture than the legacy of any other dynasty discussed in this series is present in the culture of the region it governed. Bharatanatyam is performed on concert stages across the world. The Nataraja bronze is the emblem of the Physics Research Institute CERN in Geneva, where it stands in the courtyard as a symbol of the cosmic dance of subatomic particles. The Brihadisvara temple is visited by millions of pilgrims and tourists every year and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose conservation is a matter of international concern. And the question that the Chola Empire's history poses, how does a maritime empire that demonstrated the capacity to project military force 2,000 kilometers across the open ocean fail to solve the problem of peaceful succession within its own palace, remains, in its specific form, unanswered. The institutional problem was known. The consequences of getting it wrong were demonstrable. The dynasty failed to solve it, and the failure cost them everything. The ocean they mastered is still there. The temple they built is still there. The bronze gods they cast are still there. The dynasty is gone, absorbed into the Tamil cultural identity it did so much to create, present, everywhere in the tradition, absent from the map. That is the Chola story, lords of the ocean, defeated by their own house. The 1025 CE naval expedition against Srivijaya deserves a closer examination than a summary can provide, because the specific details of how it was conducted reveal both the genuine sophistication of the Chola maritime tradition and the specific limitations that prevented the Chola Empire from converting that naval supremacy into a permanent regional presence. Planning a naval expedition of this scale required solving logistical problems that no South Indian state had previously attempted. The fleet that crossed the Bay of Bengal in 25 CE carried enough soldiers, weapons, provisions, and water for a campaign of weeks across open ocean to targets whose defensive capabilities were unknown in detail. The Tamil shipbuilding tradition had vessels capable of the crossing. The Maramaram, built in the ports of the Coromandel coast, used stone plank construction that produced flexible, seaworthy hulls appropriate for open ocean conditions. But assembling enough of them, provisioning them, and coordinating the fleet's movement across 2,000 kilometers of unfamiliar water required navigational knowledge, organizational capacity, and logistical planning that represents the peak of what the Chola maritime establishment could produce. The navigation itself was the most demanding element. The Bay of Bengal in the northeast monsoon season, October through April, has predictable, enough wind and current patterns to make the southeastward crossing to the Malay Peninsula manageable for experienced sailors. The specific stellar and solar navigation techniques that Tamil navigators used, knowledge embedded in the oral tradition of the fishing and trading, communities whose expertise the Chola Navy recruited, were adequate for maintaining course over the crossing distance. But adequate is not the same as safe, and the losses in the fleet from weather, navigation errors, and the hazards of unfamiliar coastal approaches would have been real even in a successful campaign. The Srivijayan ports that the fleet attacked, Kadaram on the Malay Peninsula, Panay on Sumatra's north coast, and others listed in the Gangaikonda Cholapuram inscription, were fortified trading centres whose defence depended primarily on the difficulty of the sea approaches and the strength of the local military forces rather than on elaborate fixed fortifications. The Chola attack exploited the specific advantage of their fleet, surprise, concentration of force, and the fighting effectiveness of trained Tamil infantry in amphibious assault conditions to overcome defences that were not designed to resist this kind of attack. The loot the fleet brought back, documented in the inscription as including the jewels, elephants, and treasures of the Srivijayan king, was substantial enough to fund Rajendra's subsequent Gangaikonda Cholapuram construction and to provide the specific motivation for conducting the campaign in the first place. Srivijaya's role as the dominant power in the Bay of Bengal trade had allowed it to tax the trade routes connecting India to China and Southeast Asia in ways that the Chola court found objectionable, either because the taxes reduced the revenue flowing to Chola-controlled ports, or because they represented a commercial challenge to Chola maritime dominance that the king found politically unacceptable. The campaign did not produce permanent Chola territorial control of Srivijaya or the Malay Peninsula. The Chola forces returned to India after the campaign was complete. Srivijaya's political structure recovered, more slowly and more weakly than before, but it recovered. The Bay of Bengal's trade routes continued to flow. What the campaign produced was a demonstration of Chola naval capability, of the accessibility of Southeast Asian ports to a determined Indian maritime power, and of the specific proposition that any polity attempting to tax trade in the Bay of Bengal did so at risk of a military response from Tamil Nadu. This demonstration had consequences that lasted decades. The subsequent Chinese diplomatic records show that the states of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra paid more frequent tribute missions to the Song court in the years following the Chola campaign, a pattern consistent with small trading, states seeking the diplomatic protection of a distant great power against a nearer and more immediately threatening military force. The Indian Ocean trade of the mid-11th century operated in a commercial environment that the Chola campaign had permanently altered, even without permanent Chola territorial occupation. The Brihadisvara inscription that records the campaign is carved in Sanskrit, the language of authority and permanence, and lists the conquered territories in a verse format that treats the military victories as devotional offerings to the god Shiva. This is not propaganda in any simple sense. The king who commissioned the inscription understood the campaign as a sacred act. The extension of Shiva's dominion across the ocean was simultaneously a military, political, and religious achievement whose commemoration in a temple inscription was the appropriate form of thanksgiving to the god who had made it possible. That fusion of military achievement, commercial interest, and religious devotion, all expressed through the medium of monumental temple construction, is the most characteristic feature of Chola royal culture at its peak. The dynasty built temples not just to honor the gods, but to make permanent in stone the record of what their reigns had accomplished. The inscriptions that document those accomplishments are the reason we know as much as we do about what the Chola Empire actually was. The temple at Gangaikonda, Cholapuram, built to commemorate the Ganges campaign and containing the inscription that records the Srivijaya expedition, stands today in a state of partial ruin in a small town in Tamil Nadu that was once an imperial capital. The Archaeological Survey of India has been excavating and conserving the site since the 1950s, and the ongoing work continues to reveal the extent of what was built and what has been lost. The temple's Vimana, slightly smaller than Thanjavor's but equally refined in its proportions, still rises above the Tamil Nadu landscape, its stone surfaces carrying the inscriptions that are still being read, still being translated, still yielding new information about the dynasty that carved them 1,000 years ago. The ocean the Chola fleet crossed is still there. The monsoon winds still reverse direction twice a year. The sailing routes from South India to Southeast Asia still follow the same geographic logic they followed in 1025. What has changed is the political and commercial order built around those routes, and the Chola Empire's contribution to building that order and the dynasty's failure to maintain it is a story that the inscriptions preserve and the temple walls make permanent. Lords of the ocean, built by the sea, lost to the palace, the Chola story does not end with a battle. It ends with a silence, the gradual quieting of an imperial court that had once sent fleets across the Bay of Bengal, reduced finally to making modest endowments to temples in a territory that was shrinking around it, maintaining the cultural forms of empire long after the substance was gone. That silence is as instructive as the campaigns. Power does not always end with a crash. Sometimes it just fades, monument by monument, inscription by inscription, into the landscape it built and could no longer hold.